Hi, thank you for joining me for my 5-minute Bible study today. We continue in the book of Colossians. We're in chapter 1, verse 25. As always, context is king, so go ahead and take a look at verses 24 through 29 to understand the full context of what we're reading today. So today, verse 25 says this: Of this church I was made a minister, according to the stewardship from God, bestowed on me for your benefit, so that I might carry fully out the preaching of the word of God. So, verse 25 gives us a lot of information about Paul. Remember, Paul's explaining who he is. He's defending his apostleship. So, he needs to have this grounding, this foundation, so that the people in Colossae will understand who they can believe. Can they believe Paul? Or do they believe these false teachers that Paul is going to argue against? So he starts out with this: Of this church I was made minister. That word minister in the Greek, it's the same word as we see back in verse 23, where Paul says that he was made a minister. And that idea of being made a minister, we recognize what he was a minister of back in verse 23. He was minister of the worldwide church, the universal church, the spreading of the gospel throughout the world. And so here we see that Paul was made a minister of that. Now, notice that it says he was made a minister. He didn't decide to become a minister. He didn't choose to be a minister. He didn't think that being a minister would be a good idea. He was made a minister. This is really important for us today because there are lots of people out there who are ministers, quote unquote. And they're out there, they're leading churches, they're going to seminaries, they're doing work out there. And some of that work is really good and valuable. But here's the bottom line. If you are not made a minister, if you choose to be a minister, then the reality is you are not a minister. You can be doing the things of a minister, but you are not a minister. Only God calls ministers, and anyone who's a minister outside of that call isn't really a minister. So just to give an example, back in the Gospels, we see that when Jesus comes to Peter, Peter recognizes who Jesus is, and when Jesus tells him to come and make him fishers of men, Peter's response to Jesus in general is, "Go away from me, I'm a sinner." And we recognize that Paul also, when he was called into ministry to be a minister, Jesus says to him, it's hard to go against the pricks of the goad. So we recognize that ministers aren't people who choose to be ministers. Rarely are good ministers chosen, the ones who are chosen from God, rarely are they excited to become a minister. Usually they recognize how big that call is, and they're fearful of being that. So if you're a minister and you haven't been called, you really need to double check whether you're doing what God has called you to do. On the other hand, if you're not a minister, but you're under a minister, make sure that that minister truly has been called to be one by God. Really important stuff there, because there are lots of people out there that are bringing the church down the wrong direction because they're doing their own thing and not what God has called them to do. So here we see that Paul was made a minister according to the stewardship from God. What does stewardship mean? Stewardship means that you are responsible for something, property, someone that belongs to someone else. So in this case, the church, the gospel, belongs to God. God has made Paul a steward of it. Paul is responsible to care for the church and the gospel. It's not Paul's. Paul doesn't own the church. Paul has nothing to do with the church except that he's responsible for it. He's responsible to make sure that the will of the owner, God, is being done in the church. So Paul has been made a minister according to stewardship from God, bestowed upon him for your benefit. So in other words, Paul's not doing this for himself. Paul's not doing this because it makes him important, because he gets good money out of it, because he gets to be a leader, because it takes care of certain situations in his life. Paul is doing this for the benefit of others. That's what ministers do. They're called by God to steward the church that's not theirs, but is God's, not for their own benefit, but for the benefit of others. And so we see this is going to be very different than what the false teachers are doing, where they're looking for themselves. Paul's taking care of others. It ends that, so I might fully carry out the preaching of the word of God. And that's the work of the minister, to do the full preaching of the word of God, preaching the gospel, preaching Jesus. Everything points back to him. And so with that, we end verse 25. Thank you very much for joining me today. If you have any questions about anything we spoke about today, please put them in the comments below. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And until then, God bless you.